last week, process this week, standard cost next week. I'm inviting you to turn in your book to E21-11, page 999. Are you aware from a business perspective what happened yesterday? Historically speaking, about the Dow Jones average. Do you know what the Dow is? Raise your hand if you don't know what the Dow is. I promise not to embarrass you. The Dow Jones average is tracking blue chip stocks, and they report on stock market activities daily, and some people use that to assess how the economy is faring. It can be misleading. Does anybody know what happened to the Dow yesterday? David?
It reached a high.
Reached an all-time high historically, and closed at over 14,000 points, which is a really huge deal. And I just thought, as business students, you should know that historically. It's okay to live under that rock you're living under and not be aware that there's a world around you. But occasionally, some of us on the outside are going to try to come into your territory and surprise you with a little bit of knowledge now and then. So that's just one. We also reached another milestone yesterday. It's self-serving of me to tell you this. It embarrasses me sometimes to bring it up. Last October, I pointed out to you that we had reached 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, and yesterday, sometime during the day yesterday, we went over 2,000, and I think that's pretty incredible. And it's not about that. No, it's really about you and your seizing the moment. Every day that we get the opportunity to be together ought to be a good day. And I'm hoping that you'll be challenged every day to do your best and to learn the most that you can. And today would be one of those good days. So today's your moment. Let's do something good. I'm reading 21-11 at the top of page 999. I hope you turned there already. The polishing department of our manufacturing company has the following production and manufacturing cost information for September. I promised you in Monday's lecture that every time I read this to you this week, I'd point it out to you. I can't read your homework problems to you, but I can point it out when we read exercises together. Materials are entered at the beginning of the process, and that's a big deal. That's an explanation for some of the things that we do. There are 2 paragraphs here, full of information. And it reminds me to say to you that there's just one thing we have to do this week. It has 5 steps. It's so predictable that we do it so many times that it could get ho-hum and redundant. I think the author's challenge is to figure out how many different ways they can present it to you. This one is in 2 paragraphs. Another one we're going to do next time is in 2 columns. They just have different ways to display this information. I'm not going to read all the production paragraph, but I'm inviting your eyes to glance through it and see that it's all about units. And just now, I'm not going to read the manufacturing cost paragraph, but invite your eyes to glance through it and see that it's all in dollars. And I will read them in a few minutes when we need to know them. Instructions. Compute the equivalent units of production for materials and conversion costs for the month of September. Let me read that again. A. Compute the equivalent units of production for materials. And when you have finished, compute the equivalent units of production for conversion cost for September. B. Compute the unit cost for materials. And when you finish, compute the unit cost for conversion cost. C. Determine the cost to be assigned to the units transferred out or finished. And when you have completed that, determine the cost to be assigned to the goods in process in ending inventory. The book described that as 3 steps. I have a tendency to describe it as 4 or 5. These are the same steps you saw in Monday's lecture. This step is not in the book just now in these instructions. And I'm going to confess to you that I've tried it without that step. And I'm convinced that things go better when you perform that step. So I'm encouraging you to help me right this minute to determine the physical units we're talking about for materials, are you willing to volunteer and tell me how to do this? While you're thinking, let me say that the other steps here are also those that I just read you in the book. So there are 4. You've seen those. You shouldn't need to write them down again. Those are the exact ones I just read you out of the book. This is a predictable calculation. This is what it takes to assign the cost to the finished goods. That's our ultimate goal. It was last chapter. It will be next chapter. What does this good cost us? Let's go back one step to last week and the virtual tour and everything we did beyond that. What are the elements of cost? What does it take to produce a product? Name them as a group. It takes...
Materials.
Go again? Oh, okay. Just so we'll sound more choirish, let's say one-word answers for these. There's some adjectives you can put in front of them. Let's say one word each. Ready? What are the elements of cost? What does it take to produce a product? It takes
materials, labor, overhead.
Owen? Say it, Owen.
Overhead.
Overhead. It takes materials, labor, and overhead. It takes direct materials. It takes direct labor. It takes manufacturing overhead. And thank you for that big hearty response. The combination of those allows us to produce a product. How do we find the cost of that product in job order last week? We kept the cost on separate job cost sheets, and we summed the costs on those job cost sheets. That was the amount of finished goods. How do you do that this week? You find the physical units, the equivalent units, the unit cost, and then you assign the cost to production. That's this list summarized. I'm still waiting for that volunteer to talk to me about the format used to find the physical units. Matthew, is it you?
Sure.
Let's go.
Are we going to take our beginning inventory?
Oh, let me do one more thing. I'm a little off timing-wise. Let's take the information in that production cost paragraph and turn it from a sentence to a T account. Could we think about last week and the journal entries we made and how this information was derived? You know, what we're doing right now is taking what the book gave us and putting it here, but I think the contrary was true. I think it was journal entries that caused this, that caused the authors to be able to write a paragraph about this. Do you see the chronology I'm describing? Yes or no? Yes? Then imagine these journal entries. How about purchase raw materials on account, debit raw materials, credit accounts payable? How about requisition materials for use in the factory, debit work in process, that one. Credit raw materials. These balances were left from the previous month. The only difference about these and other balances that we would bring over is the detail they provided. Normally we would have had one number as the beginning balance. But we've got to know the distinction between materials and conversion costs in order to make the calculations we want to make in the next little while about average method. We have to know the beginning balances. How about paid factory labor wages, debit factory labor, credit cash, or credit wages payable if it wasn't paid? Assigned labor costs to production, debit work in process, credit factory labor. Applied, incurred manufacturing overhead cost on account, debit manufacturing overhead, credit accounts payable. Recorded depreciation for the factory, debit factory manufacturing overhead, credit accumulated depreciation. Paid miscellaneous factory overhead cost, debit manufacturing overhead, credit cash. Applied manufacturing overhead to production, debit work in process, credit manufacturing overhead for an estimated amount. Who's with me right this minute? Did you hear familiar things? You should have. That was last Wednesday's lesson. That was exercise 20-8, where we covered most of those things, or perhaps all of those things. Anybody got this sum out of curiosity? What'd you get?
602.
$600,200, Logan says. I think it's a conversation with your boss. I think your boss says to you, the supervisor in the factory, I've entrusted you with these $600,000 worth of cost. What'd you do with it? And your answer would be, well, I finished some and I'm still working on some. Well, how much? Tell me the details. Can I get back with you on that, boss? Isn't this our quest? To find the cost of the goods finished. And here are the steps. Find the physical units on which you worked, Matthew. You've been practicing while I was stalling? Here we go, Matthew.
Okay, we're going to take our beginning inventory.
Yes.
1600.
Don't talk about numbers yet, Matthew. I just want to hear structure. I want to hear how it works. Tell me a format. It's beginning inventory, and then what, Matthew?
Unit started.
Yeah?
And we're going to sum
So,
those.
yeah. And what name shall be given that sum? It's my own silly little made-up name. It's not a standardized name. I call this to be accounted for, meaning in the future. These are the goods I was entrusted with. How shall we say, what should we say happened to them, Matthew? What happened to all these goods I could have worked on? I either,
You still have them or you sold them?
yeah, no,
Or you finished them?
yeah, say them again.
You still have them or you finished them?
I either finished them or I didn't. Yes? That's the same thing you just said. I either finished them or they were not finished. Somebody's going to look up in a minute and say, what does it stand for? That abbreviation. Because you weren't looking at the screen the same time I said it. So these two numbers are the same. The amount I was accountable for is the amount I have accounted for. This is kind of future tense. This is kind of past tense. Yes, Matthew? Let's plug in numbers.
Okay.
Joel's had a question in? Ask it.
So the F for finished, does that also mean like transferred out?
Yeah. I used to quibble with the book's term transferred out, and I just wanted to say finished all the time. And I've come over to their side because of my discussion about the departmental process. If we're Department 1 and they're going to Department 2, well, they're finished to us, but they're not ready to sell yet. They're not going to be ready to sell until after they leave Department 3. So Department 3 is truly finished, but this is transferred out because they're finished. You understand the difference? Transferred out. Matthew, are you talking?
Sure.
Let's talk about numbers that you could put in any of these blanks.
Beginning inventory, 1600.
1,600 units. We're reading that production paragraph right this minute. It says 1,600 units were there to start with. Then what, Matthew?
We started 18,000.
18,400 were started this month. Therefore, we're accountable for 20,000. Your boss wants to know what you did with the 20,000 units you could have worked on, Matthew. What'd you do with them?
Okay. Well, it tells us we still have 5,000 in ending inventory.
Good. And that's the only number they told us.
Yes.
And
So we're going to put 5,000 on not finished. Okay.
that's fine.
Then plug that amount, I guess.
This number and this number have to be the same. We were accountable for these. We're going to account for all of them. 5,000 are still in ending inventory. The only way in this problem to get this number is to plug it. Is that wrong? No, it's okay. How many?
15,000.
15,000 units. That's exactly the way the example in Lecture Monday worked, and not necessarily the way the next exercise we work is going to, or the next homework problem. Sometimes they give you all four numbers. Sometimes they tease you and give you some other combination. Sometimes they barely give you enough numbers to solve the problem. But there will never be too few numbers. We'll be able to figure it out somehow. I'd like to know equivalent units. These are the book's instructions. Equivalent units of production for materials, equivalent units of production for conversion cost. These are the real units, actual. We can touch them, not imaginary. Tell me about equivalent units for materials? Joel's your hand up. Let's go.
They will be the same, 15,000, 5,000, 20,000.
The ones at this bottom part, the reason for that, Joel and class, is that assumption that I read you and made a big deal out of as I was reading. All the materials were added at the beginning of the process. Since all the materials are added at the beginning, if this front row is the assembly line, if that's the beginning and that's the end of the line, then we add all the materials we need at the beginning. It's only labor and overhead that changes that into a finished product. Another alternative that we could consider that would be a little bit harder to do is to add the materials gradually. That's not our assumption. Our assumption is always the materials are added at the beginning. Therefore, whatever materials we have are the materials that we had available to work on. This, under this assumption, this and this will always be the same. Or the better way to say that probably is this will always be the same as this. You like always, don't you? Tell me about the effort we expended. How hard did we work on these, Nate?
Well, for the finished product, they're 100%.
It took 100% effort to finish that batch. Now that makes sense to me. I'm not just memorizing out of a book. It seems logical to me that if there are 15,000 chocolate chip cookies here, is anybody listening to me? And I've got a big vat over here at the beginning of the assembly line, and I've put in flour and sugar and chocolate chips and gotten the big old automatic stir thing to stir all this dough and knead it and all that kind of stuff. And then some robot comes along and starts taking out hunks of chocolate chip cookies and dropping them on the conveyor belt. And then the conveyor belt starts moving down the assembly line. And they start dropping off the end of the assembly line as finished cookies. Y'all with me now?
Yeah.
That baking them for 15,200 worth would make them a little tough on the bottom, a little burnt. Anybody with me right now? Or baking them 14,800 worth, they'd still be a little doughy right in the middle. It sounds like I'm telling the story of the three bears. Not this and not this, but just right. Yes? It took 100%. It took 15,000 units of effort to finish 15,000 units of materials. That should make sense. What about the next batch, Nate?
Only 10% effort was given.
So I put all the flour and the sugar and the chocolate chips in the big vat, and the big machine came and stirred it, and they started dropping out on the conveyor belt, and they're moving down the conveyor belt, but we decided to go home. How much effort was expended on this group?
10%.
The equivalent of producing how many units?
500.
How many of these were finished?
0.
I need somebody to fall for the temptation right this minute. How many of these were finished? Usually I can get somebody to say 500 were finished. If they had been finished, we would have accounted for them on the previous line. Not one of them was finished. You see the name of this group? They're not finished. And that's the point I'm making about this 5,000 unit batch of chocolate chip cookies, 10% down the way the assembly line. This entire batch is 10% finished, but not one of those cookies has made it to the end. Equivalent units of production assumes there's no beginning inventory and there's no ending inventory. Very gently and ask him to stay away. Please, David. Thank you. Anybody remember what I was saying?
There's no beginning of
Thank you.
Yeah.
I could have sworn you were daydreaming. Way to go, Mitchell. Way to go, Mitchell.
On the ball.
So let's pretend for a minute that we're producing each of these chocolate chip cookies before we produce the next one. So no robot. You just reach your hand in the vat and get you a big wad of dough and drop it on the assembly line and kind of watch it down the assembly line and see it baking and See it drop off the end. Okay, that was kind of fun. So you get you another cookie. Put it on the assembly line. Watch it go down the assembly line. Drops off at the end. Is that a very efficient way to produce chocolate chip cookies?
No.
If that's the way we were doing it, how many would we have produced? Working this hard on this batch, I would have produced
500.
5. That's probably a better answer. 500 cookies. If I produced each cookie before I started working on the next one, I could have produced 500 working this hard. But I was working on the entire batch and I didn't finish them all. In fact, I didn't finish any. But I finished the entire batch 10% of the way. I'm trying to measure my effort. How hard did I work? I put in enough effort this month, if there had been no beginning inventory and no ending inventory, to have produced 15,500 units from scratch. Equivalent units of production. The steps are, find the physical units, find the equivalent units, and find the unit cost for materials and conversion costs. I'm looking for a new volunteer who would be willing to describe for me the materials cost. Logan?
You take the beginning inventory and you divide it by...
From the manufacturing cost paragraph, or a better place to put it would be the T account. Oh my goodness, I wish that T account were up here someplace so we could get the numbers right out of the T account. How much was the beginning inventory, Logan? 1,600 units, but I think I'm trying to do dollars this time. So look in the manufacturing cost paragraph and see if there's something beneficial.
20,000 more?
The beginning inventory was $20,000 of materials. There it is, if you're still looking for it, class. What other materials cost did I incur, Logan?
Material cost average of the margin during the month was 177.
This month, another 177.2 was added. Now, I need to impress on you, class, this is the way this method gets its name. I probably wouldn't do it this way, frankly. I doubt you would. To take the beginning inventory and to treat them as if they were incurred this month and divide by, ooh, I should have asked Logan, what are we going to divide by? This is materials. This is materials. The materials answer from the previous step. Snowball effect. Alert, alert. Miss this, you miss the rest of it. But that's not the point I'm trying to make right this minute. The point I'm trying to make right this minute is, why would you add in the beginning inventory? And that's because this is the average method. I'm not trying to teach you the old way, nor hold you responsible for it. No, Sam, it's not going to be on the test. It doesn't hurt you to know this just a teeny bit. Under the old method, FIFO, we would have accounted for this batch all its own. But now, we lump that in with this group. We lump last month's inventory in with this month's and pretend they were incurred this month. Logan, you got me an answer? Anybody need a calculator to participate? Matthew, you want a calculator? You need a calculator? Nice toss. It was. You should have been watching. Joey, you want a calculator?
It's like a young Tom Brady. Good talk. Tom Brady. A young?
Somebody had their hand up. Who needs a calculator? Last call. Logan?
It's 9.86.
Auditors?
Yes.
$9.86 per unit was spent on the average on materials this month.
It's a really expensive cookie.
These weren't cookies that were doing two things parallel to one another. You've been hanging around Justin too long. Tell me about unit conversion costs, new volunteer. Owen.
You had $48,180 in the beginning.
The beginning inventory was there someplace. Help me find it, Logan.
It's on the right side.
This one right here?
Yeah.
There we go. And that's after what, Logan? Owen.
Thank you. You have, they're split up, but there's overhead and labor.
There's two numbers here, 102,680 and 257,140. Yes? Now, I was running a little short of room. So what I did was sum these two numbers just so I could have the room. But if I were you, class, and you've just written this down for the first time, I'd write 43,180 plus 102,680 plus 257,140. I'd show all three numbers. That's labor and overhead from last month plus labor plus overhead for this month. I got 359,820, but I was trying to make it fit. If you're with me right this minute, say yes. That is the average. We're about to determine the average from last month and this, lumping in last month's figure and including it with this is where this method gets its name. Divide by what, Owen?
15,500.
Don't struggle with that one, please, this week, class. See right this minute that the results of step 2 you're using right this minute. Divide, this is equivalent units, divide by the answer here. It's this number. That ought to be easy. What'd you get, Logan?
$26 per unit.
Is that 3 times I've called you Logan? Well, it's okay. I got to tell you an old story. My wife teaches school, and there was a lady in her school that kept calling this little kid over the reading circle, and every day she called him Charlie, and his name wasn't Charlie. And this went on and on and on and on. So he'd correct her every day, and she'd call him the next day and be Charlie. And one day she called him Charlie and realized she called him the wrong name, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know your name's so and so. I forgot. Okay, I'm sorry." And he said, "It's okay, Miss So and so. I kind of like Charlie now." So he just kind of switched over to her side. So you want it to last off. Oh, and you know that I know who you are. $26, is that what you said?
Yes.
I'm about to do the next step differently than I did in Monday's lecture on purpose. Now, because you saw it in Monday's lecture, because you worked homework, because you kind of understand it, you're likely to resist. You know, this would be a good time. Oh, I'll daydream now. He'll come back to it in a minute. You know, it'd be better if you'd listen, because there's a point that I'm trying to make later about this format. In Monday's lecture, I added this and this. The next step says, find the cost of the finished goods. That sum multiplied by the units we finished is a quick answer. I like that for quickness sake. But I like this for format sake. Earlier this hour, I asked you what the elements of cost were, and you responded very heartily. Can you do it again? What does it take to produce a product? It takes
Materials, labor, overhead.
Good. Thank you. When you think about what goes into a product, think it takes materials, labor, and overhead. If these behave differently, we could account for all three of them differently. If they all behave the same, we could do this all at once. One, materials, behaves differently than labor and overhead. Materials are added at the beginning. Labor and overhead are added gradually. Since they behave the same, the authors say, let's lump them together and save a calculation. It's not to confuse you. It's to save time. Labor and overhead we call conversion cost. What does it take to produce a product? It takes materials and conversion cost. So what materials are in this batch of finished units? I'd like to have a conversation with somebody. Who'd like to field my questions right this minute? Please, somebody. Justin. Good morning, Justin. You up for this?
Yeah, sure.
How many units are in this batch we call finished? It's there. Come on, look here. It's here.
50,000.
Thank you. There's 15,000 units of materials. How many units of labor and overhead?
15,000.
I made this point earlier.
Oh.
I'm going to try to make it again. I'm ahead of myself. We'll come back to that. There's 15,000 units of materials. There's 15,000 units of labor and overhead. Anybody know what I'm thinking? Or we'll say it like my granddaughter does. She says, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Anybody know what I'm thinking right now? It's about these two numbers being the same. You don't yet, but I want you to know. Anybody know what I'm thinking?
Now we can
Joel?
finish. You can multiply 15,000 times the sum of 9.8.
I rejected that alternative a minute ago. I'm going there in a minute. I already confessed I did it that way and lectured. I'm trying to do this differently. No. Good try though. Anybody know what I'm thinking? No wonder they were finished. If there's 15,000 units of materials here and 15,000 units of labor and overhead, no wonder they were finished. I need you to see that those two numbers are the same. That's not 15.2. And that's not 14.8. That's not porridge too hot, porridge too cold. That's just right. We had this conversation. This is just a new way to say it. Tell me if you're with me.
Yes.
Yes? It's not a coincidence that these two 15,000s are the same. That's a plan. That's how they became finished. Now, materials cost $986, and labor and overhead, Justin, cost $26. That comes out to be $390,000. This sum, somebody,
537,948.
thank you, David. Auditors, no sense? Tell me no sense. Did you say sense?
I didn't make sense.
Did you say sense, David?
I did.
Is this the number you said?
Within a couple.
I didn't know there was any rounding necessary. Tell me if there is. Do it again. Some people are objecting.
Okay.
$537,900. If you do it this way, and you're not going to because you like the other way, like Joel said, but I'm still pleading with you to be an open-minded just for a moment. You might like it this way in a minute. If you do it this way, you're probably going to have to take one step further and divide by 15,000 to get the unit cost to be $35.86. Because managers want to know that. How much was that last month? And next month they're going to be asking, how much was it this month? It's that comparable unit cost thing that we're trying to achieve so that we can use that for management purposes. If there's a spike here, we want to control our cost. If we're holding down cost, we want to pat some people on the back. Keep doing a good job. Tell me about the other approach. I will you real quickly. What Joel said so eloquently was, you saw me in Monday's lecture, take the $986 and the $26 and sum it and multiply that by the number of units finished to get this number a whole lot faster, but that's not the point. I'm not just after an answer. I'm after a format that I might understand and benefit from in the long run. And that's the reason I suggested it to you. Let's make a journal entry. A volunteer. We did all this work to get this number to make a journal entry. I need help. Shall I call you Owen? Logan?
The finished goods, 537,900, and credit working process.
Might be right. In fact, I'll just give you credit for a right answer. Debit finished goods, credit work in process, or Justin, it might be,
Work in process for the work in process.
and credit.
Work in process.
Dog chasing his tail here.
Going from one plant to another.
One department to another. Way to go, Justin. It might be debit work in process, whatever the next department's called. We don't know. The book didn't tell us. Credit this department. This was polishing. They did tell us that part. We don't know. I just thought I'd introduce it because that's part of this week, is to talk about that departmental thing. If we don't know, or I'm sorry, if this is the last department, then Logan's right, it's finished goods. How did we do this last week? We summed the cost on the job cost sheets, and it was that sum that was the amount of this entry. How are we going to do that this next week? Show up Monday and I'll show you. How do we do it this week? We determine the physical units, the equivalent units, the unit cost, and then allocate the cost to the goods we finished and the goods we didn't. Let's post. 537.9 ought to be posted as a credit to that work in process account that I wish were up here the whole time. Logan said a little while ago the debits totaled $600,200. We were having a conversation with the boss. The boss called and said, "What'd you do with that $600,200 worth of cost I entrusted to you?" He said, "Well, boss, I finished 537,900 of those, and I'm still working on 62,300 of them, and you and your boss may be content with that number. But you or your boss may not be content with that number. Your boss might be the curious sort. Tell me some of the details in that 62,300 figure. What does that consist of?"
Material conversion.
Can I get back with you on that, boss? I'll call you right back. Anybody want to lead me through this, Matthew?
Sure.
Let's go.
Okay.
What's it take to produce a product, Matthew?
What do you mean? Oh, materials, labor, and overhead.
Good. Let's account for the materials, labor, and overhead. Now, remember when Joel objected earlier and I kept insisting we were going to do this whether you liked it or not? What I want you to see right this minute is how similar the format Matthew's about to describe is to the format where I showed the details of this finished goods figure. Do you remember us doing this moments ago, yes or no?
Yes.
The reason I did it this way moments ago was for such a time as this. Let's take this pattern and replicate it and change the numbers that are necessary. Like, Matthew, how many units are in this batch?
5,000.
5,000 units are in this batch. And what did I spend on them per unit?
186.
See how easy that was to grab, Matthew, when you did it the other way? Right there before it? That comes out to be
49,300.
49,300 was also increased by how many units of effort, Matthew?
5,000.
He said with confidence?
5,000.
No.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
You are. I think you are. You're hedging on me. You think you're trying to fool me and you're not.
Are you talking about those costs?
I'm talking about how much effort did I expend on this batch
Okay.
while they were right here in my presence to work on.
500.
See, you did know what I was talking about.
You gotta.
Wait! I'm basking in the moment just for a second. Anybody know what I'm thinking?
No wonder they weren't
Say it, Owen.
No wonder they were not.
No wonder they were not finished. Do you see that these two numbers are the same and therefore we finished them? Yes or no?
Yes.
finished.
And if these are not finished, these two numbers can't be the same. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? Say yes or no.
Yes.
I'm trying to make this easy for you. I'm trying to make it make sense. Did we spend any money on those 500 units?
Yes.
How much per unit?
$6.
Did you see me try to cover it up on you? I wish I could. 500 times 26, Matthew?
Is 13,000.
13,000 units of cost were added in this department this month. Let's sum those, Matthew.
Okay. 62,300.
62,300, and you really did add it, didn't you, Matthew?
I summed it differently. I did a little different.
I don't care how you did it. Did you really sum it?
Yeah, that's how I was a little.
Okay, there we go. Ever seen that number before?
Yes.
Oh, look. That's the balance of the account, and we just proved it. And look, 537.9 plus 62.3 is, anybody sum those?
600,200.
600,002. So here's the conversation you're with your boss, the complete thing. Now, I pretended a minute ago that we hadn't done all this, but maybe the boss waited until now to call. What'd you do with those $600,000 worth of costs I entrusted to you this month? Well, boss, I'm glad you asked. I finished 537,900 of them, and I'm still working on 62.3. Have no fear, boss. We'll finish those next month. It won't be a problem. Are you with me or not? Do you have a question? Are you good at this yet? Justin's got a question.
So for
For the finished ones, we divided 537.9 by 15,000.
Yeah, if you use Joel's method, you already know this.
Yeah.
But if you show your work, you don't know this, and you'll want to know the unit cost of the goods finished for comparison's sake, for decision-making's sake. It's better, more accurate.
So you wouldn't do that for the ones that aren't finished?
Well, they're not finished,
Okay.
so it's not going to be a good figure yet.
Okay.
You know, it's not going to be something you can compare. Next month, there may be a batch that's 20% complete. Well, how can you compare a 10% batch with a 20% batch? That's not comparable.
Yeah.
Those are not equals with equals. But a finished batch, the unit cost ought to be about the same. If it's distinct, if it's, help me with the word? Appreciably different? What's a good word for this? Significantly different, then that's where managers step in and manage.
Okay.
We got to give them some numbers to manage. Did you learn something today? Hands up. Let's see them. Have a nice day. Practice, practice, practice.